April Bard, 1968, Quảng Trị Province, South Vietnam, 42 hours. The grass was burning again. Not from napalm, not from artillery. Just the raw heat of gunfire, tracers ripping the jungle like lightning through a thundercloud. Screams punched through the air, some in Vietnamese, some in English, and some that were just noise. Echoes of agony, confusion, and desperation. And in the middle of it all, Private First Class Marcus Doc Gaines, age 20, was crawling through mud, blood, and shrapnel fragments without his rifle. The only thing he carried was a green medical pouch, a pair of trembling hands, and 3 bullet wounds that refused to stop bleeding. Just 20 minutes earlier, Lima Company had been on routine patrol near the Songbo River, a sector known to be quiet, at least by Marine standards. But quiet never meant safe, and ambushes were never loud. Until they were. Before we continue, if you're interested in the untold practical stories of World War II that nobody teaches, hit subscribe. These stories changed warfare but never made it into official histories. At 15:21 hours, the jungle on their left flank came alive. 2 RPDs opened up from the high ground. A line of claymores detonated from behind, triggered by command wire. Then came the RPGs. Within seconds, the first 4 Marines in column were either dead or down. Doc Gaines had been in the center of the formation, talking to a sergeant about an infected foot blister. That conversation ended when a 7.62 millimeters round tore through the air and caught Gaines high in the left shoulder, spinning him down into the mud like a rag doll. The fire was so intense that no one could even reach him. No one could move at all. But Marcus Gaines hadn't joined the Marines to be safe. He had joined because his older brother hadn't come home from Da Nang, because his high school friends thought medics didn't count as real Marines, because his mother had begged him not to, and because he wanted to save people, even if it meant dying doing it. So when the first screams came, "Doc, Doc, I'm hit," Marcus didn't wait for the all clear. He rolled onto his side, pulled out a half-full syringe of morphine, and bit down on his own collar to stifle the pain. Then he started crawling. 10 meters ahead, Corporal Jimmy Soto was bleeding out from a gut wound. A second RPG had blown out his right hip, and he was trying to hold his intestines in with one trembling hand. Gaines reached him in 30 seconds. The first thing he did was throw himself across Soto's chest, shielding him from stray fire. Then, with one good hand and a mouth full of blood, he tore open his med pouch and applied pressure dressing to the stomach wound. "Hang on, Jimmy," he whispered. "You're not dying here. Not like this." That's when the second bullet hit him just below the ribs. He gasped, froze, blinked twice, then shook it off. "You're not dying either," Soto mumbled. "Doc, you're bleeding." Gaines just smiled. "So are you." The field was hell. By now, at least 6 Marines were down. 2 had been dragged into shallow craters. 1 had crawled halfway into a rice paddy and stopped moving. The NVA were pressing in from the east, automatic fire now almost constant. And Gaines? He should have stopped. He should have called for medevac and waited behind the rock wall with the other survivors. Instead, he stood up. "I see 3 more. I'm going." He didn't make it 5 steps before the 3rd round caught him right thigh, through and through. It folded him like a card table. But he didn't scream. He just kept crawling. Over the next 11 minutes, Marcus Gaines would treat 14 wounded Marines under open fire. He applied 7 tourniquets, 5 pressure dressings, and 3 injections of morphine. He performed 2 field airways with his bare hands. And he was still bleeding from all 3 of his own wounds. By the time the rescue team finally broke through, pushed in by a flanking squad from Kilo Company, they found Gaines slumped against a burned-out M151 Jeep, gripping a Marine's hand and whispering the Lord's Prayer. They thought he was dead. He wasn't. Not yet. April Bard, 1968, Quảng Trị Province, South Vietnam, 13 hours. The dust-off bird circled once and disappeared. Too hot. Too exposed. The LZ was a kill zone, open rice paddies on 3 sides, a burning hedgerow to the north, and sniper fire still popping from the tree line like angry wasps. The medevac pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Negative LZ. We can't land under this fire. Mark smoke if you stabilize the area. But the area wasn't going to be stable anytime soon. The NVA had broken Lima's left flank. Marines were scattered, wounded, or pinned down. And in the middle of it all, Doc Gaines was still moving. Bleeding, pale and barely conscious, he dragged a private by the collar into a bomb crater. The kid's leg was missing below the knee. Arterial spray had painted the mud crimson. Gaines didn't panic, didn't even flinch. He reached into his pouch, now soaked in his own blood, and pulled out a strip of rubber tubing and a cravat. One-handed, he looped it high above the stump and twisted. The blood stopped. The private's eyes fluttered. "Doc, am I gonna make it?" And Gaines leaned close. "You're not gonna die today." The fight hadn't stopped. If anything, it had intensified. Now the NVA were probing the Marine positions, trying to flush out survivors before the sun went down. In a dry creek bed, Sergeant Mathers and 2 other Marines were trapped behind a downed tree. Mathers had a sucking chest wound and shallow breathing. Every minute, he slipped closer. Gaines heard them shouting. He stood up again, even though his leg was locking up, his thigh was on fire, and his shoulder felt like it had been torn out with a crowbar. "Doc, get down!" someone screamed. Too late. He was already sprinting or limping across open ground. Tracers ripped through the air, chewing bark, cutting leaves, but none hit him. He collapsed behind the tree and immediately went to work. "Need to seal the chest," he rasped. No more dressings left. He tore a piece of plastic from his map pouch and slapped it over the hole. Taped the edges with medical tape and chewed cloth to seal the 4th side. Mathers started breathing again, barely. "You're not gonna die today either," Gaines muttered. Then he blacked out. He came to seconds later when a bullet cracked inches from his head. The NVA had spotted movement. Someone threw a smoke grenade, but the wind took it. Not enough cover. Then came the roar. An M60 opened up from a ridgeline, one of Lima's last functional machine guns. Lance Corporal Alex Country Harlan had lugged it 400 meters through marsh to provide cover fire, and he wasn't stopping. The NVA ducked. Gaines crawled. Back through the creek, over broken glass, through tangled vines, into another field hospital made of tree stumps and shell craters. 2 more Marines were waiting. Both gut-shot, both fading fast. He didn't ask names, just grabbed gauze, started packing. The world shrank into rhythm's heartbeat, breath, scream, silence. By 1645, Gaines had treated every surviving casualty in Lima Company's forward sector. 14 in total. Every one of them was still alive. And now, finally, the medevac bird came back. Gaines refused to get on first. "The worst go first. I'll go last." He passed out before the second wounded man was even lifted. They found 3 bullets in him. 1 shattered his shoulder. 1 cracked a rib. 1 passed through his thigh and nicked the femoral artery millimeters from death. But he lived. So did all 14 Marines he treated that day. When asked later why he kept going, Marcus Gaines didn't have a big speech. "Didn't want to leave anyone behind," he said. "They wouldn't have left me." May 1968. Naval Hospital, Yokosuka, Japan. The smell of antiseptic and iodine stung Marcus Gaines's nostrils as he blinked under the white ceiling lights of Ward 3 Amperes. No gunfire, no screaming, just the slow rhythm of a heart monitor and the distant squeak of rubber soles across hospital tiles. He wasn't in the jungle anymore. He was 6,000 miles away from Quảng Trị, and he hated it. Gaines had been unconscious for nearly 30 hours after collapsing at the LZ. He woke up halfway through the medevac flight to Da Nang, mumbling about tourniquets and more gauze. The crew chief thought he was delirious. He wasn't. He was still working. By the time he was flown to Yokosuka for long-term treatment, Gaines had 3 surgeries scheduled: bone fragments in his shoulder, arterial repair in his leg, and shrapnel removal from his lower abdomen. But the worst wounds weren't visible. He kept asking the same question. Did they all make it? Every nurse, every corpsman, same question, over and over. When someone finally brought the casualty list, 14 names, 0 KIAs, Gaines cried, quietly, flat on his back, staring at the ceiling. He didn't cry when he got shot. Didn't cry when he tied off a friend's leg with a bootlace. But this undid him. 2 weeks into recovery, a Navy chaplain visited his bedside with a stack of letters. Most were from the Marines he'd treated. Scrawled thank yous, jokes about morphine, a sketch of Gaines with angel wings and a flak vest that said Doc. But one letter wasn't from a Marine. It was from a woman named Mrs. June Mathers in Charleston, South Carolina. The mother of Sergeant Mathers, the Marine with the chest wound, Gaines had sealed with a piece of map, plastic, and spit. "I heard what you did for my boy," she wrote. "They told me he would have died without you. I hope someone told your mama." That letter didn't make him cry. It made him furious, because no one had told his mama. Back in Tallahassee, Florida, Marcus Gaines's mother had gotten nothing but a Western Union telegram. "Your son has been wounded in action." No phone call, no detail, just sterile words and a silence that choked her. She didn't know her boy had saved 14 lives. Didn't know he had refused to be lifted until everyone else was safe. Didn't know he'd almost died 3 times and still found the strength to crawl toward more gunfire. Gaines couldn't hold a pen, but he made the nurse transcribe a letter on his behalf. "Tell her I'm okay. Tell her I didn't run. Tell her I did my job." Word started to spread. His company commander wrote a report to HQ recommending him for the Navy Cross. Another officer suggested the Medal of Honor. The hospital CO filed a nomination for the Silver Star. But paperwork moved slower than bullets. By mid-May, Marcus was walking on crutches. He hated it. He begged to go back. "I can still treat. I don't need to shoot. Let me go back." The answer was no. He had done enough. More than enough. The Marines weren't going to lose their miracle medic just to prove a point. That didn't stop Gaines. He started volunteering in the Yokosuka Trauma Ward, helping incoming wounded Marines from Quezon and Hue. Some were kids younger than him. Some didn't know what a real medic looked like until they saw the black 20-year-old with scars on his neck and a look in his eye like he'd seen too much. "You get hit?" one asked. Gaines just nodded. "How many times?" He smiled. 3. "But don't worry. You're safe now." Back in Quảng Trị, the men of Lima Company scratched his name into a piece of steel salvaged from a wrecked jeep and nailed it to a tree near the old battleground. The plaque read, "Doc Gaines was here. And we're still alive. July 1968. Camp Pendleton, California." He wasn't supposed to be there. Doctors told him he was medically unfit. Command told him he'd done enough. Even his mother, after finally reading every letter, begged him to stay home. But Marcus Gaines wasn't wired that way. The war wasn't over, not for him. Not for the men still bleeding in jungle mud. So the moment he could walk without crutches, he filed for redeployment. The Navy denied him. So he filed again, and again, until, finally, someone maybe out of respect, maybe just worn down, stamped the papers. Return to duty. Limited field medical. He was going back. Before he left, he visited the VA hospital in San Diego to see Sergeant Mathers, the Marine whose life he'd saved with a map pouch and tape. Mathers was half the weight he used to be, scarred, coughing, and recovering from a collapsed lung. When Gaines walked in, the room went quiet. Mathers looked up, eyes widening. "You're supposed to be dead." Gaines grinned. "So are you." They laughed. Then they cried. Neither one admitted it. 2 weeks later, Doc Gaines stepped off a C-130 onto the tarmac at Da Nang. Same jungle heat. Same smell of diesel, rot, and fear. But something had changed. Word had gotten around. To the Marines on the ground, Marcus Gaines wasn't just another doc. He was the doc, the one who got shot 3 times and kept moving. The one who crawled through bullets with his guts hanging open and still stopped to give a wounded kid morphine and a joke. Guys from other units came just to shake his hand. Some handed him letters, medals, cigarettes. One gave him a carved bamboo cross. "I don't go to church," the Marine admitted. "But I figure if you're still breathing, someone up there is watching." Gaines was assigned to a forward aid station outside Hue, not in combat technically. His job was triage, minor surgery, prepping casualties for evac. But the front line always had a way of finding him. August 5th, a fire team from 1st Platoon got pinned down in a dry creek bed. 4 wounded, 1 KIA. The radio call came in. Need corpsman. Immediate. No medics left upright. Gaines didn't wait for orders. He grabbed his bag, ignored the protests from command, and ran. It was déjà vu. Tracers above, broken bodies below. Gaines reached the 1st Marine, a young lance corporal with half his calf missing. Tourniquet. Pressure. Morphine. 2nd Marine shrapnel in the neck. Airway blocked. Gaines used a pen tube and slit the throat open just enough to clear it. 3rd Marine already dead. 4th, buried in mud, only one eye visible. He dug with his bare hands. By the time the dust-off came, all 3 wounded were stabilized. Once again, Gaines refused to board first. Once again, the medics had to carry him, not because he was wounded, but because his leg had started giving out again. Too much strain. Too many old wounds, ripped open by new ones. That night, a Marine taped a new sign over the aid station entrance. Doc Gaines, the man bullets hate. It stuck. From then on, everywhere he went, jungle trails, firebase bunkers, ammo dumps, the joke followed him. Don't worry, Doc's with us. Bullets avoid that guy. And yet, the danger never left him. On September 3rd, during a mortar attack on the outer perimeter, Gaines was knocked unconscious by a near miss. His hearing never fully returned in one ear. Still, he woke up dazed, bleeding from the scalp, and immediately asked where the wounded were. The corpsman treating him laughed. "You're the wounded." Gaines growled, sat up, and said, "I'm also the doc. Let's go." By the end of his 2nd tour, Marcus Gaines had logged over 200 battlefield medical actions, treated more than 90 combat wounded, and walked away from 6 ambushes, 3 mortar strikes, and a sniper round that nearly killed the man standing behind him. But to the men he saved, none of that mattered. What mattered was this. When the bullets started flying, Doc Gaines ran toward the screams. Decembero 1966, Shiopt, Marine Corps Base Quantico, Virginia. Snow dusted the parade ground like powdered chalk, a rare stillness in a year soaked with blood. War raged on halfway around the world. But here under the quiet flagpole of Quantico, a ceremony was taking shape. Rows of Marines in dress blues, reporters with frozen fingers gripping notebooks, a Navy band tuning instruments, trying to keep time with the wind. And in the center of it all stood Corpsman Marcus Doc Gaines, spine straight despite the limp, chest covered with commendations, but eyes distant as if he were still in Vietnam, still crouched in jungle mud, still plugging holes in men with his bare hands. The ceremony began with citations. The Navy Cross, the Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, an oak leaf cluster. Applause echoed across the field, formal and crisp. But Gaines didn't smile. He hated standing still. Hated being treated like a symbol. He wasn't here for medals. He never had been. The Secretary of the Navy read the citation. For extraordinary heroism under fire. For disregarding his own grievous wounds. For saving 14 lives in a single engagement at the risk of his own. Private First Class Marcus A. Gaines demonstrated valor beyond the call of duty. There was more. But Gaines barely heard it. His eyes were locked on the crowd, searching, hoping. She was supposed to be here. His mother hadn't come, not out of protest, but out of fear. She'd written to him a month prior. "I can't watch them pin medals over the same spot where my baby was shot. You know I love you, Marcus. But I don't think I can watch them call it heroism when it almost killed you." He didn't blame her, not one bit. After the final salute, a major handed Gaines a folded flag and whispered, "This is for what you did, but I hope it doesn't define you." Gaines nodded, shook hands, then disappeared into the cold. No press interviews, no photos, no headlines. Just silence. Back at the barracks that night, the celebration was smaller. A few guys from Lima Company had flown in. One Marine now out of the service handed Gaines a worn Zippo lighter with DOC save scratched into the side. "You lit the jungle up, man, in more ways than one." Another Marine pulled out a cassette recorder and played a tape from their fire base in Quảng Trị. Voices crackled through the speaker, some drunk, some just relieved. Yo, Doc, this one's for you, brother. You made us believe we could make it out. No one dies when Doc's around. Gaines laughed for the first time in weeks, but it didn't last long. Later, alone in his bunk, he unfolded the casualty list again. 14 names. 14 lives pulled back from the edge. He remembered every face, every scream, every moment of hesitation he ignored. But there was one name not on that list. PFC Ronald Denton, hit in the throat, dead before Gaines even got there. 18 years old. First patrol. No photo. No funeral he could attend. He circled the name in pen. Next time, he whispered to no one. That was the moment he realized something. The medals didn't weigh nearly as much as the names. In the months that followed, the Corps offered Gaines a promotion, suggested he take a non-combat training position, even hinted at a book deal, a speaking tour, maybe even a movie adaptation. He refused all of it. Instead, he filed new orders, requested Vietnam again. When the CO read his paperwork, he stared in disbelief. You've done more than most men do in 10 lifetimes. Why go back? Gaines looked him in the eye and said, because someone out there's gonna scream Doc, and no one's gonna answer. He didn't go back as a corpsman this time. He went back as a combat medical instructor, embedded with frontline units. He would teach other medics how to do what he did, how to make impossible choices, how to hold lives together with tape, tourniquets, and sheer will. The battlefield had nearly killed him. Now, it would become his classroom. March Milnaw Cantanaw Thregan. Firebase Ripcord, a Shao Valley. It was supposed to be a lecture. A quiet, controlled 2-hour block for Corpsman Marcus Gaines to teach first-tour medics how to triage under fire, how to pack a wound, how to stop the shaking, how to not throw up when the blood came fast. But this was Vietnam, and the enemy didn't wait for lesson plans. The shell landed less than 200 meters away. A dull crump, followed by shouts from the south perimeter. Incoming! Then a second round. Closer. This one hit a storage bunker. Gaines was already moving before the dust had cleared. He barked orders to the stunned medics in front of him. Half were still teens, fresh from Pensacola or Balboa. Get your kits. Follow me. Now. Some hesitated. Now. They moved. By the time they reached the blast zone, it was chaos. A Marine lay curled behind sandbags, both legs shredded. Another had taken shrapnel through the lower jaw, choking on his own blood. Someone was screaming for a corpsman. Gaines didn't flinch. He dropped to his knees, slid in the mud, and pointed to the new trainees. You, pressure dressing, high thigh. You, airway clear. Pull his head forward, tilt, check the tongue. You, morphine injector, outer thigh. Wait for my count. They moved like robots. But they moved. This wasn't a drill anymore. He worked on the jaw injury himself. The Marine was gargling blood, drowning in it. Gaines stabbed a needle into the neck cricothyrotomy and inserted a field tube made from the barrel of a ballpoint pen. Gurgle. Cough. Then. Breathing. The boy's eyes widened. He was alive. The other trainees had stopped shaking. Their hands were steady now, their brows dripping sweat. But they were doing it packing, sealing, injecting, whispering calm to the wounded. Gaines didn't have time to be proud. Another explosion. This time, it hit closer outside the comms shack. A young radio operator was hit head laceration, shoulder pierced with antenna fragments, shock setting in fast. Gaines ran toward the body, but one of his trainees sprinted past him. I've got this one, Doc. Gaines stopped short, watched, and nodded. By the time the sun set, they had stabilized 9 wounded and saved 6 that would have bled out in minutes. The firebase commander shook his hand. You saved this camp, not just with medicine, with discipline. But Gaines didn't smile. I didn't save anyone. They did. All I did was show them what to do when the world ends. Later that night, by the dull orange glow of a ration stove, one of the new medics asked him, "How do you stay calm?" Gaines didn't answer at first. Then he said, "You won't. That's a lie they tell you in training. You won't be calm. You'll be terrified. But you'll move anyway." And that's the difference between a medic and a miracle. In the months that followed, Gaines traveled across 5 provinces, teaching, demonstrating, stepping in when things went sideways. He wasn't just a corpsman anymore. He was a combat medic school on 2 legs. He taught them how to use a sock as a pressure pad, how to hold a man's hand while stuffing a wound, how to lie to the dying just long enough for a bird to arrive. One time, a trainee froze under fire. A sniper round had killed the Marine next to him. The new corpsman dropped his bag and curled into the dirt. Gaines dragged him upright by the collar. "They don't get to die because you're scared." Then he threw the medical kit at him. "Now move." The kid did. And he saved a man that day. Later, that same kid carved into the mess tent wall. Doc Gaines. The scar that teaches. By late 1969, Gaines had trained over 300 field medics, many of whom would go on to save hundreds more. His name became something whispered before patrols. If you go down, pray docs trained your medics. It wasn't hero worship. It was legacy. But for Gaines, there was still one thing he hadn't faced. Not bullets. Not jungle. Not blood. Home. And it was coming faster than he was ready for. October 1970. Columbus, Ohio. Doc Gaines stepped off the plane at Port Columbus International Airport with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a cane in his right hand. He'd been shot twice in the leg and once through the shoulder blade. The limp was permanent, the pain manageable. But what rattled him most wasn't in his bones. It was in the silence. No band, no welcome home banners, no family in sight, just a janitor sweeping near baggage claim and a Vietnam vet in a wheelchair trying not to be noticed. "Welcome home," the vet said quietly. Gaines nodded. "You too." He'd been gone 3 years, 3 lifetimes. His mother opened the door with a gasp, hands trembling, hair streaked gray as if she'd aged a decade. They hugged for a long time, but she pulled back suddenly. "You smell like burn cream and jungle." He laughed, but she didn't. The next few weeks were filled with what they called readjustment. Doctors, VA interviews, psych evaluations. None of them knew what to do with him. They gave him paperwork, brochures, pills. One nurse, maybe 22 years old, told him, "We've got great new group therapy programs. You should talk about it." Gaines looked her dead in the eye. "You ever talk about holding someone's guts in your hands?" She blinked. "Didn't think so." At night, he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing the rattle of AKs, the snap of an M16 bolt, the shallow breathing of wounded Marines whispering, "Doc, Doc." He started keeping a notebook beside his bed. Every time he woke up, he wrote a name. Some were real, some weren't. But each one was someone he couldn't forget. He tried working. A friend got him a job as an EMT. But after 3 weeks, he quit. The sound of sirens made him clench his fists. The first car crash he responded to, he froze. "I don't know how to help when the bullets aren't flying," he told his supervisor. He applied to college on the GI Bill, sat in a biology class for 2 hours before walking out. The textbook definitions of trauma and shock felt like insults to what he knew. One morning, he went to the grocery store and bumped into an old classmate from high school. "Hey, Gaines, you still in the Corps?" What was that like? He opened his mouth, then closed it. What was he supposed to say? That he once used his belt as a tourniquet on a man whose femur was sticking out like a snapped broom handle? That he kept morphine injectors in his socks because pockets got too bloody? That the only reason he was alive was because a 9-year-old kid named Lopez threw himself on a grenade and didn't make a sound? It was fine, he finally said. But it wasn't all gray skies. One day, he received a letter from a Marine named Henderson, one of the 14 he'd saved back in Quảng Trị. It read, "Doc, I'm married now. Kid on the way. I named him Marcus. I remember what you said, move, even when you're scared. I tell myself that every day. You saved more than my life. You gave it direction." Gaines folded the letter, put it in his notebook, didn't say a word for an hour. But when he stood up, his limp didn't feel as heavy. Soon after, he volunteered at a local VA hospital. Not to talk, to listen. Sat beside burn victims, sat with amputees, sat in silence with men who didn't want to hear another doctor lecture. And when they whispered, "Doc, it still hurts," he said, "I know, but you're here. So now let's figure out what that means." He wasn't healed, but he wasn't drowning either. And for now, that was enough. Mai 1973, Arlington, Virginia. The invitation arrived in a plain envelope. No medals, no ribbons, just a typed line at the bottom. Lima Company, Bard Battalion Reunion, num years since Quảng Doc Gaines stared at it for a long time. He hadn't seen most of those men since the dust-off, since the night of the firefight that changed everything. Some of them he'd carried. Others he'd yelled at, patched up, held together with one hand while firing with the other. He'd never asked if they made it home whole, if they made it home at all. He packed the letter into his jacket pocket and boarded a bus bound for D.C. The reunion was held in the back of a VFW hall off Route 1. Plastic tables, cheap beer, the smell of barbecue and shoe polish. But inside, ghosts walked. There was Mathers, the sergeant with a collapsed lung now missing 2 fingers but smiling like a kid again. There was Henderson, who'd named his son after Gaines. There was Big Mike, the radio man, who used to joke that Doc's bag had more miracles than the Pope. They saw him and the room went still. Then the first Marine stood up. "Doc." The second raised a glass. "Doc." The third, limping, same as him, shouted, "Get over here, you stubborn bastard." Laughter broke like a wave. Gaines couldn't speak for a full minute. They talked through the night, recounted the ambush, the crawl, the blood-soaked map case. "You remember when you told me to shut up and breathe through your nose while you were plugging my gut wound?" one said. "You remember when you slapped me across the face to stop me from passing out?" "You remember Lopez?" someone asked. The room fell quiet. Yes, they remembered Lopez, the kid who'd thrown himself on a grenade and didn't make a sound. The one they never talked about. Gaines reached into his wallet and pulled out a folded page, a letter, worn, yellowing. "His mother wrote me," he said. "Told me she was proud. Said he always wanted to protect people." Silence. Then someone stood, raised their drink. "To Lopez." All glasses lifted. "To Lopez." Later, Gaines stepped outside for air. The night smelled of pine and diesel. Soft guitar music drifted from the open door. Someone was telling the story again of how Doc once used a broken helmet as a makeshift splint. He lit a cigarette. A voice beside him said, "You ever think about staying in?" It was Henderson. He was a postal worker now. 2 kids. Still carried a photograph of their squad in his wallet. Gaines exhaled smoke. "Yeah, sometimes. But I figured there was more I could do out here." "Like what?" "Teach. Write. Maybe talk to the kids who think war is a movie." Henderson nodded. "They need to hear from someone who bled for it." The next morning, before they parted ways, Gaines handed out laminated cards to each of the men. On them were 2 phone numbers, one to his VA office, one to his home line. "If the nights get loud," he said, "call me. Don't sit in the dark." A few laughed, a few cried, none argued. They understood. That night, back in his apartment, Gaines sat by the window with a cup of coffee and no lights on. The reunion had stirred things up, the good and the bad, but he felt something different this time. No guilt, no dread. Weight. And for once, it felt shared. Not just carried by him, but by the brothers who made it home. The phone rang at 12:43 a.m. Marcus Gaines woke instantly. No grogginess, no confusion. Just that old surge of adrenaline that never truly left his bloodstream. The same jolt that used to follow a gunshot or a scream in the jungle. He picked up on the second ring. "Doc." A shaky voice. Male. Maybe 30 seconds. It's Charlie Owens. You remember me?" Gaines sat upright, heart pounding. The name clicked instantly. Owens had been a fresh-faced private on his first patrol when he caught a Claymore's spray to the shoulder. Doc had dragged him through mud, packed the wound with rags, and shouted him conscious the whole ride to the medevac. "I remember, Charlie." There was silence, then a sound that made Gaines grip the phone tighter. Crying. Not wailing, not sobbing, just that quiet, hollow crying only another soldier would recognize. the kind that didn't need words. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. I smell the gun oil, the jungle. I hear Henderson yelling and you screaming at me not to die. It doesn't go away, Doc. Gaines stared into the dark. It won't, he said softly. But neither will you. He talked Owens down for over an hour. Through panic, through guilt, through the sound of a .45 being locked back into its case. By the end, Owens was calmer. Not fixed, not healed, but breathing. Thanks, Doc. I didn't know who else to call. Gaines hung up, sat in silence, then opened the drawer beside his cot. Inside was a notebook. He turned to the back page, wrote, Nov 6. Owens called, alive, then closed it and went back to bed. The ledger, that notebook became his ledger of the living. Every time a Marine called drunk, afraid, alone, he wrote the date, the name, the outcome. By 1975, it had 46 entries. Some were calls in the dead of night. Some were surprise visits. One man showed up at Doc's doorstep shaking, carrying a bottle of whiskey and a loaded .38. Gaines took the gun, poured the whiskey, sat on the floor with him until dawn. He wasn't just their corpsman anymore. He was their lifeline, their confessor, their reality check when the flashbacks came hard and the noise inside grew louder than the silence outside. One day, a young VA psychologist asked him, "Why do they call you and not us?" Gaines didn't answer for a while, then said, "Because I bled where they bled, and because I didn't lie to them when they were dying. That kind of truth sticks." Letters and legacy. By late '74, Gaines began speaking small rooms, high schools, community colleges. Not about glory, not about medals, but about cost. "Every bullet you fire," he'd say, "leaves two holes, one in the enemy and one in you, and only one of them heals." He wasn't anti-war, but he was anti-fantasy. And students listened. Some left in tears. Others came back after class, whispering that their father never talked about the war, and now they understood why. He compiled his field notes, letters, trauma tricks, even jungle improvisations into a small manual, titled it Doc's Guide. How Not to Die Before the Medevac Arrives. The Marines unofficially circulated it across 3 divisions. By Christmas that year, he received a card. "Doc, you saved my life twice. Once in Quảng Trị, once in my garage. My wife and kids thank you. Merry Christmas." Inside was a photo. A little boy, maybe 5, holding a puppy, smiling. The back was labeled, Marcus Jr. Gaines stared at it for a long time, then placed it in his notebook. Under the heading, Another Life That Made It. Veterans Day, the 11th of November 1982, Washington, D.C. The name stretched across the black granite wall like the trail of a war no one could ever fully come home from. 58. 000 lost. Too many Gaines had held in his arms. Too many he couldn't save. He stood in front of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, a simple folded cover in his hand. To those who never got the chance to heal. Behind him, people gathered. Families, old Marines, journalists, politicians, a choir of schoolchildren. Gaines barely heard them. He was reading a name. Lopez, R. "Hey, brother," he whispered. We kept going. It had taken him years to get here. Years of refusing interviews. Years of pushing back against the sugarcoating of war. Years of calls at midnight, funerals in the rain, and veterans sitting in his living room because the VA had a 3-month wait. But now, he'd come to the wall to finish something. In his jacket was a copy of his old field manual, Doc's Guide, and a letter. He placed both below Lopez's name. "You were the first one I couldn't save," he said, "but everything I did after was because of you." That night, Gaines gave his first and only national interview. A PBS crew caught him outside the memorial. The reporter asked, "If you could tell Americans one thing about Vietnam, what would it be?" He didn't flinch. That the bravest men I ever knew didn't carry rifles. Some carried morphine, some carried stretchers, some carried each other. And the scars they brought home don't show up on X-rays. Legacy and silence. In 1985, Gaines retired from the VA, but not from the fight. He opened a small center for combat medics, using his own pension. No budget, no fanfare, just a cinder-block room with a coffee machine, a worn couch, and a sign on the door that read, "If you remember blood, come in. You're not alone." By the time he passed away in 2001, aged 53, the notebook by his bed had over 600 names. All Marines, all still alive. Burial and aftermath. They buried him at Arlington with full honors. But not because of medals, because of the men who showed up, dozens of them. Some limping, some graying, some still haunted. Each one walked past the casket and laid a patch of cloth on top. Bits of field jackets, radio slings, old blood-stained armbands, relics of the men Gaines had saved. One placed a single morphine syringe, another, a ballpoint pen barrel, a reminder of a cricothyrotomy that saved his life. The final man stepped up and left only a card. On it were 5 words: "I made it because of you." Years later, a plaque was quietly installed at the VA hospital where Gaines had worked. It read, "In honor of Corpsman Marcus Doc Gaines." He stopped bleeding, he started healing, and he never let go of the ones who made it home. And in the stillness of that hallway, beneath flickering fluorescent lights, the legend of the 20-year-old medic who got shot 3 times and still saved 14 lives, lives on. Not in textbooks, not in statues, but in phone calls that were answered, in notebooks filled with names, and in the simple truth that sometimes the most heroic thing a man can do is not stop running toward the screams.